Hello, everyone. Big welcome to you from all four corners of the world. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ophelia Leon, Chair of ICMEMO, ICOM's International Committee of Memorial Museums in remembrance of the victims of public crimes. This is a third in ICMEMO's webinar series dedicated to discussing new strategies and creative solutions which museums can implement during these challenging times. And today's topic is the role of museums in times of civil unrest. Suai Aksoy will introduce Dr. Spencer Crew, Interim Director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And then his talk will be followed with commentaries by journalist Kahinda Babegbetan from Nigeria. Thank you all. We pick up today where we previously left off with keynote speaker Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, suggesting that we focus on how museums might take an active role in the creation of safe spaces for dialogue within the community, particularly during the times of conflict. And we started this series of webinars at the beginning of lockdown because we believe that a crisis can be an opportunity to acknowledge problems and implement solutions. COVID-19, for example, has revealed, one, the deplorable state of healthcare systems in the so-called first world. But it has also rung alarm bells as to how quickly we can suddenly lose all our liberties in the midst of an informative void. And what's more, these situations are easily exploitable by irresponsible demagogues. Some of them could have been elected officials. We have recently seen just how far they can go in misconstruing reality. Historian Ursula Munsell reminded us of such historical parallels in our previous webinar. Now, the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, has brought worldwide attention to the deep Latin racism present in American society still today. Recognizing a problem, the necessary first step to finding solutions. I think we can all agree on that. And we seize the opportunity to find creative alternatives by one, acknowledging responsibility, that's first of all, but also by deeply listening to the vulnerable, to those most affected, and by analyzing the underlying reasons and not settling for quick fixes or accepting false promises. We're memorial museums, and we know where racism, bigotry, greed, and delusions of supremacy can lead if left to their own devices. So in these difficult times, memorial museums, I think, have unusual opportunities and obligations as well to interact with governments and audiences alike in an effort to stay alert, to better adapt to the times, and to stay true to our mission of withdrawing lessons from history in a way that is pertinent today. To this effect, we've organized two previous webinars as well during lockdown with hundreds of signed participants from all the continents. So please have a look on our website. The papers and recordings are available online. And because we're conscious of the fact that we're living historical moments, that today is the history of tomorrow, as I've said before, a tomorrow that we can have suddenly fast forwarded to. This is the reason why we invited our keynote speaker today, Dr. Spencer Crew, because his museum is already embodying the notion behind this new proposed role of museums as spaces interacting with their communities, safe arenas for dialogue. His museum's platform, Talking About Race, is playing a leading role in addressing issues of racism, responding to current challenges, and we want to share those findings and practices with you. Thank you, all of you, and without further ado, here to introduce Dr. Spencer Crew is our very dear Suai Aksoy. Thank you. Suai, the floor is yours.
Good day to all. I'm so delighted to be with you today. Thank you, Ophelia. Thank you, ICMEMO, for allowing us to speak out our belief in museums' capacity to change lives for the better. Museums are among the most trusted institutions in the society, as surveys show year after year. Just by this attribution, if not for anything else, museums rank as public spaces where people can actually get involved in politics and take part in policy-making processes in order to define their collective future. The increasing pressure put on museums by communities and various community groups stress well the notions of accountability and transparency. Museums have a great potential in facilitating or supporting democratic hearing processes. I would therefore say that beyond being spaces of memory, museums have to serve as maintainers of social consciousness, because it is this consciousness that bridges memories to each other and to the current time and motivates us to act. One may ask, do we as museum professionals have the necessary competences and skills to tackle this? With the growing awareness about the social role of museums, our work now requires more than what it used to require in the past. Today we talk about defining new participatory and decolonial methods, restorative justice, creative problem solving, mediation, conflict resolution, all complementary to museums' main factors, not in contradiction or contrast to our traditional collection-oriented duties, but providing them with a meaningful context to work in and making museums relevant in this era. In order to assume this responsibility, we need to build trust with our diverse communities. This trust is only possible if we can find the right balance between organizational professionalism as solid centers of evidence, knowledge production, and research on the one hand, and our activist efforts to uncover the hidden and often unspoken contested realities and dynamics of the past and present, including the ever-growing inequalities and exclusion on the other hand, through community resilience and solidarity with civic movements and struggles. And this latter is only possible if we regard these issues not as external to our organizations, but as integral issues that we need to face first within our internal structures, such as our human resource policies. We should not forget that without having a clear diversity and inclusion policy at our museum workspaces, we cannot claim that we are contributing to remedying the challenging issues about and around diversity and inclusion within the broader society. This is exactly why we need organizations like the Smithsonian that act as role model by representing a perfect balance between these two complementary characteristics of what a museum is in the 21st century. So today, I feel especially fortunate and honored to introduce to you the esteemed veteran, the acting director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, Spencer R. Crew, a remarkably well-rounded person of an academic as well as curatorial background, and an author of many books on African American and public history. He will talk and inspire us about the role of museums in the time of civil unrest, an unending universal condition that communities face also today. We will be lucky if we hear him tell us also about his museum's outstanding program entitled Talking About Race. So let us start and enjoy this treat. May I give the floor to Professor Spencer Crew with thanks.
Thank you so very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you this morning. I want to begin with an article that was written a few years ago by the then director of the Brooklyn Museum by the name of Duncan Cameron. He wrote an essay that was entitled "The Museum, a Temple or the Forum?" And in it, he argued that museums were suffering an identity crisis because they could not decide where they stood on these issues. Were they a temple or were they actually a forum for conversation? And he defined the differences in this way. He said as temples, museums were church-like places of contemplation and very thoughtful reflection. Staff members had sifted through all the available artifacts. They determined which ones were worthy of exhibition and admiration and put them in exhibition. Placing them on exhibition signaled that at the end of that was the end of the discussion, and that the curators had decided what the people coming to the museum needed to know. Now, in contrast to this, he thought that the museums that followed the path of a forum created a very different atmosphere. In forums, ideas and new perspectives were the dominant ideas going on there. And public engagement was the most important thing these museums could do. For them, artifacts were the vehicles to promote spirited conversations and to encourage new ideas about their society. The final conclusions were not the most important goal, but debate was central to the process. And conversation itself was the most important thing to come from it. The key task in these kind of organizations was to share their authority and to encourage the public to engage with them about issues of concern. Doing this, they believe, made their institutions more lively, and they made them much more engaging spaces for their visitors. But it also helped to reflect the interests and the concerns of the users of their institutions. Now, while Cameron did not object to the idea of the forum, he really firmly believed that the temple and the forum could not exist in the same space. And he thought any effort to integrate the two functions was a mistake to be avoided at all costs. Now, I'm not sure I really entirely agree with Cameron, but I do believe he offers a useful perspective worth considering as we think about our museums. And I think it fits with discussions that are sort of circulating today in our field around the role and function of museums. On one end of the spectrum, museums view their roles as repositories for important materials and artifacts. The role of the public is not emphasized in these models, but instead the staff are the experts, and they determine what is best and what to best share with the public. The public is not consulted in this conversation. For them, there's little shared authority in this model. Instead, they are the experts, and the public is there to embrace what they have to share with them and to enjoy the intrinsic value of the materials that the curators and the staff have put on display. Museum professionals who see their roles in this way often been described as essentialists, that essentially their task is to take care of and determine what objects are most important to be shared with the public. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, our museum staff will see their institutions primarily as a place of a forum. For them, museums are places where ideas are explored and traditional ways are challenged as part of the ongoing work of that institution. Their goal is to raise questions and to attempt to stimulate critical thinking in their audiences when they come to their places. The objects they collect are platforms for exploring the world and seeing it through a very new perspective, and hopefully a new critical perspective. The visitors in the focus of these individuals are the focus rather than the objects in terms of the experience people have coming to these institutions. They measure their success by the strength of the strong, positive connection with the communities that they serve as a consequence of these encounters. This has been described as the adaptive model, which emphasizes the need and the interest of the people as the ultimate responsibility of these institutions. The visitors and their concerns are what drive the work of that institution. Now, the dissonance between these models parallels, I think, the discussions about the definition of museums that are sort of very much current in our field and certainly taking place in ICOM. One of the issues simply stated in this conversation is, and to be discovered, is whether museums should serve as advocates for social justice or other issues challenging society, on one hand, is the argument. Others say that some believe this should be central to the work of cultural institutions. Others believe it expands too much the functions of museums. It takes them far out of the sphere where they should be functioning. So really the question today is, should museums take a socially activist role, especially in times of social upheaval? And I want to talk more about that in the course of my presentation today. And that's the question at the heart of my thoughts in terms of my conversation. Now, the centerpiece of this thinking, of this conversation about museums, and I think for more than a decade has been the question of museums and their community. How do they connect together? What is their relationship? And how should that be stimulated going forward? And how do museums provide value to their communities? Now, there's little argument, I would say, that museums want to be seen as important and valuable community assets, that they are something they want others to see as important and useful in their activities. What is more important, though, in our conversation is who defines this and what defines value for those communities. How an institution looks at what is its acceptable role and the role it can play in times of local upheaval is really key to try to determine their role and their importance. If the institution has not built trust, it becomes more difficult for it to play a respected role in its community. Trust is critical, and you have to build that over time. And to find trust, you have to increase your connection with your community and your neighbors. And I think what this entails is proactively seeking engagement and conversations that will help to determine how you are perceived by your community. And I think it's a mistake sometimes that some of our institutions try to do a self-assessment, decide on their own how they are being seen by the community and are they doing the right things. I think that's a mistake. I think instead what has to happen are conversations with your users, conversations with your nearby communities to really begin to understand how they see you, not how you think you are being seen. Now the challenge is that these conversations can sometimes be very uncomfortable, but I think the opportunity to learn and to internalize community needs and perspectives can be an invaluable asset for a museum and for our institutions. I think fully engaging in this practice can transform an institution from being an imposing, uninviting presence to a place that values the viewpoint and the contributions of its neighbors. But it's important that these actions result from conversations that must be more than just, and the actions that come from them must be more than just a one-time response to these activities. Sometimes organizations will have these conversations, will create an exhibition and a program, execute it, and then go on to the next thing. And that will not build the kind of connection and kind of trust that you want between your organization and your communities. What you have to demonstrate, as our presenters before me have said, is an ongoing commitment to dialogue and engagement and connection with the communities where you're located. For museums that have not created these connections to the community, I think this current moment in our history of our world and of our communities is precisely a time for them to begin to think differently about themselves and to begin these bridges between themselves and the communities where they exist. And this is an important thing for them to do because there are many other institutions that are really beginning to intensify their commitment to equity. And our museums that have not done that should go in that direction as well. And I think museums who have not historically been viewed as community partners now have an opportunity to begin to enhance how they are viewed by the communities where they are located. And I can offer you, I think, an interesting model of how this can happen and how museums can begin to change how they're perceived within their community. There's a museum in the city of Richmond, which is the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Under the leadership of its museum board and of a new director who came on board in 2017 by the name of Jamie Boskett, the museum acknowledged that it had not built strong relationships, especially with the African-American community in Richmond. And they felt they needed to improve how the museum was viewed by their local residents, how they perceived the usefulness of that museum. Consequently, to begin to better understand that, the museum and the director launched a series of initiatives to strengthen dialogue and communication with their local community. They began to do this by sponsoring meetings with members of the community to better understand how they were perceived by those community members and to learn what the museum might do to improve that perception as they move forward. These dialogues prompted the museum to assemble a group of advisors to maintain an ongoing relationship and dialogue with that community. In addition, they decided to initiate a new exhibition, which they entitled Determined, the 400-Year Struggle for Black Equality. And the exhibition was put in place to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved African Americans in the North American continent. And their exhibition looked at this larger question, but also focused on the history of African Americans in Virginia and African Americans, especially in the city of Richmond. In the process, they began to collect objects and artifacts that had been kept in the houses, the basements, and the attics of African American residents of that city. And what this allowed them to do is to increase their connection and their credibility in the city, but also to enrich the collections they had themselves within the museum to make them more diverse and to make them represent a larger variety of ideas. It also improved, I think, the representation of African American stories in their museum. And it let local residents know that the museum valued their history and also the artifacts and the material culture that they'd been saving. For the institution, the exhibition came to represent something very important. And they said, I quote, that it represented the museum's commitment to representing all Virginians and their diverse stories. And this became the mantra of how the museum moved forward. The exhibition itself, when it opened, was received very positively by the Richmond community. It also increased African American appreciation and visitation to the museum. On the opening day of the exhibit, the museum drew its largest numbers of visitors ever in a single day, 7,000 individuals. And at a speech dedicating Arthur Ashe Boulevard, which Arthur Ashe was an important tennis player, African-American tennis player, and a former resident of Richmond, and the museum lobby to have the street in front of it named the Arthur Ashe Boulevard, it really helped to enforce their presence in terms of supporting African American issues. And interestingly enough, at the presentation, the nephew of Arthur Ashe gave a talk. And during that talk, he made an interesting comment. He said that for a long time in his community, the museum had been seen as a place not for people like him. But after that day, he said that was not the case anymore. They saw it as a place that they could embrace and see as part of their community and important to them as they went forward. I think this commitment to the African American community extended beyond just a single exhibition for the museum. Previously known as the Virginia Historical Society, the institution changed its name to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And they saw this as a way of signifying their commitment to access and to inclusion to the surrounding community and to those who they wanted to draw into the museum. They began to host programs and lectures in conjunction with the exhibition. They also created an online exhibition that once the determined exhibition went down, they continue to have a presence of that exhibition, of those objects, of those stories, as part of the ongoing life and history of the museum. Most importantly, the museum continued to interact with the African American community through other museum projects. It hosted a State of Black America town hall in its auditorium. It also developed an agreement with the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia there in Richmond to house and to digitize its collections for use by both institutions. The Cultural Center did not have the resources to do it and was worried that its collections might deteriorate over time. And the museum, Virginia Museum, stepped in to be a partner in making sure they stayed well taken care of. Bosket, I think, in speaking for the museum, said he saw these actions as a long-term continuing relationship which will remain central to the work of that institution. What he hoped was that the museum would become, and I quote, the place where you go not only to understand, but to feel and absorb why these past events, people, and their decisions matter today. I think what has happened is that his efforts and the dedication and commitment of his board have made the Virginia Museum of History and Culture a trusted community partner and one that the community now turns to in a positive way. And I think what it does is to exemplify the immense benefits of a sustained, committed effort to changing the perception and the role of an institution within a community, and that it's possible to do with that kind of sustained action on their part. And I think it also indicates the importance of taking deliberate steps to make a museum more of a community partner. So this community partnership is important. And I think this is an important step for museums to take who have not done this in the past, especially at this time, in a role that they should look to embrace and try to make their own. But I don't want to stop there. I think it's also a role that museums who have created a connection with their communities and have a trusted partnership is a role that there are roles that they can also take to, I think, further enhance that relationship, but also to be of more value to their communities. And I think that's something we've tried to do at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And there we've sought ways to connect with our global visitors as well as our regional DC community, we have a much larger group of people we have to answer to. One of the programs that we've developed to begin to do this is called A Seat at the Table. What it does is to bring together individuals from a cross-section of communities for a family-style dinner and an evening of conversation. Food is always a good starter for conversations. What the program does is to focus on dialogue about social justice, religion, culture, identity, and community. There's a featured speaker at the start of the meal and during the meal to begin to create the conversation and the atmosphere for further talk. Then at tables where people are assigned randomly to sit, the participants there are encouraged to reflect on the topic that the speaker has brought before them, and then to share out their thoughts among themselves, to take notes, and then to share those thoughts out to the larger group. The idea behind this is to create a forum where all voices can be heard and new ideas and perspectives can be shared and exchanged, getting people to hear what other people are thinking about an idea and then learning and growing as a consequence of that conversation. And I think the outcome of this conversation, this gathering, goes beyond just convening the community together to talk. What it does also for us as a museum is takes us out of the center role as a single source of knowledge and value and begins to share that problem of that power of knowledge and ideas with the entire group to say that everyone has something to contribute. Also for us as a museum, it's a chance for listening and learning about the ideas and the concerns of those who are our users and who are our larger community. What it has done, I think, is to allow us to grow and learn, become more sensitive, but it's also continued to encourage productive dialogues across lines of differences and to provide spaces for healing in moments of local or national crises, trying to get people who might not talk to each other otherwise to sit down and talk and maybe grow more sensitive as a consequence of these conversations. In addition, during our current global crisis with COVID-19, what our museum has done is to seek to provide an outlet for users to express their reactions to the events swirling around them. We want to find a platform, a way for people who are suffering from COVID-19 quietly in their homes, confined in their neighborhoods, to express what's going on, to talk about what this moment means to them. And one effort that we've put in place to try to make that happen is the creation of what we call our community curation platform. This is a digital space that seeks to create, to creatively capture the impact of this pandemic that we're facing with people who are suffering from it in a time when we really can't get to them face to face, physically together. But instead, what the platform does is allow us to connect with them and to encourage them across the nation and across the world to electronically share their important images and thoughts they're having during the midst of the pandemic. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? How is it affecting their lives? Now, for us, we are particularly focused on the African American community and navigating the things they're facing in this health crisis. What we know is that African Americans and others who are in sort of vulnerable communities are suffering much more highly here in the United States from the impact of COVID-19. And what we've especially done is to try to reach out to communities where we've already established relationships and ties, and where they know us and trust us. This way, they feel comfortable sharing their innermost thoughts and concerns with us and on this platform, so that we're able to really capture, I think, the deep feelings of these individuals in a way that we couldn't otherwise had we not built those connections previously. We think that this will be an invaluable experience for the museum and for researchers in the future to be able to understand what people are experiencing and how they can think about this when future pandemics hit our society. I think the project further encourages the participants to recognize the historical importance of their experiences and to consider the historical value of their own material culture. Sometimes in our own lives, we don't give value to the things that we keep, the things that we hold important as a larger historical story. What we're trying to do is to give them that platform to see that what they have to say, to share are important. And I think our hope is that it might encourage them to then share those artifacts with a nearby institution, or to share it with the Smithsonian, our museum itself, so we can have a collection of materials that represent their experiences. I think this same principle applies to capturing the energy of the people who participated in the protests against racism that are taking place here in this country. In many ways, I believe their actions have generated a possible watershed moment in the history of the United States and perhaps in the history of the world. In collaboration with other Smithsonian museums and units, our curators have been talking to protesters and collecting their posters, their signs, and their artwork to bring into our collection. Our staff have approached this collecting process very carefully and with great sensitivity. What we recognize that these materials have tremendous emotional meaning and value to the people who have created them. They put them up to make a statement. They put them up to indicate how they're feeling about these issues. And they might not wish to have their objects removed and taken by a museum, even though our intentions are a positive one. So we really want to make sure we have discussions with them to say what we're hoping will happen, and therefore to create a relationship that allows us to get these materials in a way that values them and honors them in the ways that the creators would like it to happen. In addition, we hope to conduct and record interviews with some of these individuals, these participants. We want to capture their thoughts as to why they are protesting and what outcomes they hope to generate. We think it's really sort of fascinating to have the possibility to actually capture real-time thoughts of these individuals. We sort of say it's like going back in history and having a chance to interview people who have passed away who we'd like to know what they were actually feeling, especially people who are everyday people, not just the leaders. We think our collecting process around the protest has value for both the people from whom we are collecting, but also for our museum's desire to capture a record of this very historic moment. One of the things our museum should be doing is capturing those histories and making sure we have the background for that available for future generations. The other role for us to consider as museums and as institutions is our educational role, and which I think is another pathway for us to add value to our communities. In this capacity, we can provide tools that capture critical issues of the moment and to offer ways for users to address these issues and to create tactics to overcome the challenges that they face. Now, we have found that one of the most effective and far-reaching vehicles for accomplishing this responsibility is through the use of digital platforms and digital mechanisms. A digital platform can reach past the walls of the museum and connect with interested parties who wish to make use of it. So the idea is, how do we expand beyond just the floor of a museum, the classrooms in our museum, and really make connections far beyond the walls of our institutions? This was the principle underlying the creation of our portal called Talking About Race, which was created by the staff of our museum over the past year. But we shared it publicly this last June the 1st. The goal of this activity was to construct what our education staffs call a brave space. That is a space that offered ways of constructively engaging a critical issue facing American society, the issue of race, and what we should think about it and what we should do about it. Now, this portal emerged from a decade of work of learning by our museum's educational department and staff. Even before the doors of the museum opened 4 years ago, our staff began offering workshops for educators that were entitled, Let's Talk, Race in the Classroom. The goal was to help them sensitively navigate issues of race with their students as teachers, because they were issues that came up often. They weren't sure how to have this discussion in a very useful kind of way. Through trial and error of the workshops, our staff identified worries and challenges faced by many educators. Some of these issues were external ones that were brought in or recognized from the larger community, but others were internal issue and baggage carried by the teachers themselves. How do they think about that? How do they get past their internal issues? To help them, our staff turned to a number of experts in the field who could offer them guidelines and ways of beginning to create ways to engage people on these topics. As they got this information and began to apply it, they then tested it and refined the concepts and the ideas and the concepts over time. What they saw was that they saw this work as the core responsibility of themselves and of the museum, and an important tool that they could share with classroom teachers. What the staff then recognized was that this work they were doing, as wonderful as it was not having an effect broadly enough. They knew that the people who came to the workshops benefited from it, but they recognized that there were more people who could use this, and they wanted to figure out how to begin to share this with a larger group of people. And so to increase the impact of the workshop, the museum organized a team to broaden the reach of the material that was shared and created as a result of these gatherings. The consequence of this was the creation of a carefully crafted multimedia portal called Talking About Race, which I described earlier. The goal of this portal is to provide tools to promote and to support conversations about racial identity, racism, and both historical and current impact of race on society in America. The platform acknowledges that how challenging these discussions can be, that it's not easy to sit down and talk about race, especially in a society that's been denied race as an issue for such a long time. What it then tries to do as a platform is to create helpful entry points for generating exchanges, conversations, and learning for those who make use of it. The belief is that the more the issue is squarely faced and understood, the more likely we'll see people take actions that might increase or lessen racism's negative impact on our society and on the world. The platform employs several techniques to increase its effectiveness. Most importantly, it encourages the participants to be reflective and to be thoughtful. At the start, the portal directly confronts the reality that we are all aware of race, both our own race and that of others. And very often we sort of deny that. People want to say, well, I don't see race. Race is not important. Well, in fact, it is important. And we want people to embrace that idea up front. And what we also know is that children at a very young age are very aware of these differences and need to be able to understand how to interact with these issues. Rather than ignoring or denying the reality of race and of racism, the platform encourages participants to engage and understand the impact of this thing. Specifically, it offers pathways for 3 sectors of society to begin to engage with this concept. We talk to educators, we talk to parents or caregivers, and we talk to individuals who are committed to equity. These are the 3 places where we've started this conversation on this portal. The idea is to help them wrestle with the historic role of racism in the United States in terms of its history, but also of its negative impact on life in America today, and I would say around the world. Embedded in each pathway are activities, multimedia presentations, questions, and action steps that are designed to facilitate learning and insights about race and how to deal with it. The goal and our hope is to encourage our users to think, to talk, and then act in opposition to racism. And our users are encouraged to embrace their responsibility to resist racism with the understanding that not doing so allows it to flourish. If you don't act up, speak up, it continues to have vitality. The goals of the portal, I think, are ambitious, but it really is an important task for our museum, and I would say for many museums. Commitment to social justice is a long-standing core principle of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is also a position that our museum supporters have come to expect of us. If we look at our social media pages and the information we get back, our visitors, our users expect our museum to take steps in this direction, to be a thought leader, to be an action leader in these kinds of areas. Consequently, we think creating the portal and continuing to add new ideas, new learnings, new resources to it is a central part of the role that we should play as a museum. And also to add guidelines for other sectors of society who might want to take advantage of this. And we're looking at how else we can expand the people we talk to specifically so they can use this as a stepping stone for conversations in their own circles. I think for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and for other cultural institutions who see social responsibility as an important part of their mission, it is our responsibility to provide tools and programs in times of social change that acknowledge and speak to our current issues and experiences. If we don't do that, we're falling short of our responsibilities as institutions that have value in our communities. Overall, I think museums are part of a larger society and community. They do collect and perform research and share their work through exhibitions. That's one of the things that we do. However, I think it's not enough to create experiences for visitors that are enjoyable to observe, but do not offer food for thought. We should be stimulating critical thinking on the part of our visitors. Our programs and presentations must do more than just provide a good environment. I think we will seem tone deaf if our work does not recognize the issues swirling around us and try to respond to them. It will cause members of the communities in which we reside to see us as detached and unconcerned about issues of importance to them. It will reinforce the view of our organizations as imposing, impersonal, and uninviting places, not connected to the communities where they are located. Most importantly, to paraphrase a civil rights activist and social critic, Eldridge Cleaver, if you are not involved in solutions, you will be perceived as part of the problem. If your museums are to remain valued partners in their communities, they should not and must not be viewed as part of the problem. We need to be part of the solution. And that's what I think is the task that faces us in a world that's facing a lot of social unrest. We need to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crew. We started out with why suggest that museums can become safe spaces where constructive dialogue can take place and the voiceless. If anyone has any doubt that that this is the road to follow after your contribution, you started out with the article from Cameron as museums as temples or forums, one or the other. And you have presented so many varied and valid examples of how both realities can live side by side and should live side by side, precisely because we are already informed spaces that offer credible, historically researched and contrasted information, is why museums should take on this role, because museums raise questions, as you said, they inspire critical thinking, and in opening up to the communities, as you say, grow more sensitive and build trust, demonstrate ongoing commitment and conversation with their communities, not by doing self-assessment, but by engaging with the community. And just to illustrate this point, is I take your own quote, the reason for doing this is to illustrate the richness and complexity of history. Right. That it's not a singular story, and that there is no one single truth. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at the racial unrest in America from the perspective of Africa, where the slave trade started, and where the problem is not racism, but rather what Suai Aksoy referred to in her introduction to Dr. Crew's talk as the ever-growing inequality in societies. And so we invited Kehinde Babigmetan, who's a journalist and publisher of Echo News, a weekly community newspaper based in Lagos, Nigeria, who has covered the country's social, economic, and political developments for over 3 decades. He's been sub-editor of The Guardian, Concord, The Country, Vanguard, and was former vice chairman of the Lagos State Council of the Nigeria Union of Journalists. Kehinde, the floor is yours, please.
Let me start by commending Mr. Spencer's very elucidating presentation. And my takeaway from it basically is about the process of gathering materials from the ongoing civil unrest for preservation in the museum community. I take my pick up from there is to look at the Nigerian experience on why you have civil unrest and what we need to do to ensure that our museum also document materials from our own experience in the process of the people engaging the government and the state in defense of their right to existence. Of course, Judge Floyd's example raised the issue of the origin of slave trade. And we know, of course, that Africa started, was where this whole thing started. Our experience in Africa basically is that in the early days, there were people who could not survive and so had to surrender themselves for some kind of indenture. But that changed with the commodification of slave into a trade. And our experience is that from that period to the period of colonial exploitation and to today, you still have the markets operating against the interest of the people. Essentially, the structural adjustment program, for example, which came in the 80s, sought to restructure the economy of many African countries to the dictates of Western market system. The implication has been that the programs of devaluation, programs of privatization, many of these programs work against the large majority of the people, the peasantry, the working class, the middle class, all the major heterogeneous communities operating within the new colony of Nigeria were lost out in the structural adjustment program game. And so that led and that bred a lot of unrest. Not just that, it also undermined democratic processes and institutions in Nigeria, such that when you take a look at Nigeria in the last 20 years, particularly from 1988, when SAP was introduced up to now, what you have is a litany of social struggles, a litany of strikes, a litany of people trying their best to see how they can reverse the gains of SAP so that they can regain their own human dignity. And because of some of these issues, therefore, it occurs to us that when you find the competition for social surplus in Nigeria today has had to rely on primordial factors of ethnicity, of religion, of social networks in trying to gain access to jobs and in trying to be able to survive. This, therefore, has brought some sense of second-class citizenry even within the country in such a way that some ethnic units believe that because they are not in power, they are unable to access public resources. If you consider this kind of situation, therefore, and you look at the condition of the blacks in America, you realize that there are some parallels in terms of access to resources, in terms of social stigma, in terms of ability to be able to develop yourself within the system. And therefore, we begin to raise issues concerning how foreign programs put in Africa has worked against the interests of the people. And we raise issues, I'll take, for example, the visa lottery. We raised the issue whether the visa lottery, for example, which eventually encouraged many African middle class elements to come into the US, whether that program, whether it's undermined the capacity of the black in the US themselves to negotiate for jobs and security. We also raised the issue, how some of the development that we find in terms of race relations in the US, are also operating a level of ethno-religious relations in the African new colonies. And going forward, we believe that just as Mr. Spencer is working on gathering materials for the preservation of this experience that the George Floyd incident instigated, we in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, should be thinking of having a museum of popular struggles that could put into context the struggles of workers, unionists, peasants, against the efforts of the Nigerian effort to implement the structural adjustment program against their long-term and short-term interests. This basically is where I want to come in here and to say that ultimately the role of the museum in that process is to just as Mr. Spencer has also said, is to provide public education, to provide the reservoir of past experience so as to be able to teach the present generation of people what happened and why it happened and things like that. So that basically will be my commentary for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kahinda. Kahinda, when you spoke of the World Bank's structural adjustment program and its inadequacy for African countries and for Nigeria in particular, and how imposing a Western model doesn't necessarily work on other cultures, our colleague, Luisa Onuaho from the National Museums of Nigeria, I wanted to put into context how that fits into the museum world for a moment. Can you do that, Luisa, please?
Thank you, Ophelia. Basically, what we have in the museums in Nigeria is a case where the museums, the policies actually work against the people for whom the museums are made. So ideally, it would have been ideal if when putting up exhibitions, for instance, the people for whom these exhibitions are going to be put up for are called, you know, to make decisions, to be part of setting up of these programs. Because the museums in Nigeria, sort of, the people look at them as elitist in nature. And therefore, the community, even when you have a community museum, people would be reluctant, you know, to visit such places. So I think the policies are too European or too not, it doesn't sit well with the people. So most of the times we find that the people who visit the museums here are not the people whose objects are actually in the museum. So that's a major, it's a major problem, it's a major issue here in Nigeria, which I hope with time we'll be able to, I mean, it's not everything that comes from over there that will sit in well with Nigeria. So we need to have museums that are created by the people, for the people, that we do not have yet in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luisa. Thank you all very, very much. We've received many, many questions, some of them which you've answered, Spencer, through the course of the talk. Also, many, many congratulations to all of you. How does a museum go beyond capturing the story and documenting history to enabling change in social systems and society to occur?
I would suggest that one of the ways you do that is by trying to impact how people think about the issues that the society faces, to broaden their empathy for the challenges faced by others, and to work to create a space where I think people feel that they're given an opportunity to exercise their citizenship. I think we do that through the programs that we run. In part, one of the conversations always that museums can be places where safe conversations can take place among people who might not talk to each other otherwise. And I think if we create exhibitions and programs that stimulate that kind of thinking, and you bring in a diverse audience, it allows people to leave there seeing the world differently. And it's through their seeing the world differently you begin to see society change. It's not an overnight process, and I think it takes time, but I think as educational institutions or as educators, that's how you see your role, is how are you providing new viewpoints for those who come to you so they go back into the world with the ability to think critically and to look more closely at what's happening around them.
Thank you very much. I think we forget how deeply embedded our conditionings are to so many of these issues. I don't think anyone thinks, or most people don't anyway, that we're racist. And yet, if we analyze the conditionings that lead us to be racist, it's almost like we should actually start meditations in our museums, because that process forces you to look at those conditionings deep from society, from family, from everywhere. And until actually we acknowledge that and change that, problems will continue to be. But yeah, as you say, it's a little by little.
What we often hear in our museum when people come to visit and see exhibitions is that I didn't know that. I didn't learn that. And part of what we're trying to do is offer them new insights into just the history of how things operate so they can recognize how it impacts different parts of this population.
Another question, and first, obviously saying how great this is, your brave space as the online forum, and then Laura poses a question: how will the average American or international know about this portal for conversation, and how will you know if it is having an impact on creating a more just society? That's a long term, it's, as you said, but the first question.
Well, I think the way you'll know about it is, one, by going to our webpage. That it's front and center on our webpage. But what we've also done, and we've been very fortunate as well, is that a number of other organizations have seen it, have seen it in a very positive light, and are also featuring it on their webpage as well. So what we know is that the word is spreading, that it's available as a tool to use. What we do know in small group settings, at least, that it's very effective, that our educators and working with teachers coming to them have gotten feedback from them about how useful it is. Also, in our conversations now with other organizations, they have very much been excited by this and want to begin to find ways they can use it to help change how their organization works as well. So the initial response, I think, has been very positive and indicates that what's contained in the platform is useful. Now, I think in the long term, you have to figure out how much of a ripple effect it is having. We're optimistic, but that'll take some time to really be able to measure and to understand.
Absolutely. This next question, you've already addressed when you were saying that museums don't necessarily need to engage in self-assessment, but rather go out to the community and ask them, and that's the real thermometer, and how uncomfortable they could be with some of the answers, but accept that. So this is what this relation refers to. And it says, the museum provides space and moderates this conversation, but can indeed every voice be heard with the same sensitivity? I mean, are museums ready to listen to views they don't share? Is the floor of the museum open to everybody, or rather limited to those who share ideology of the museum? What is your experience? And although you addressed this a bit, I'd like to give Katarzyna this possibility.
Well, I think that the goal is to make a museum a safe place for conversation, a safe place for ideas to circulate. And you try to provide that kind of a platform. That's sort of what the portal is trying to do, is to allow those who come in with biases and are afraid to talk about them to have space to make that happen. And you try to allow all the voices to have a chance to share what's with them. Can we guarantee that? I think it would be unwise of us to say or think that we can do that absolutely. But I think what we can do is make a commitment to try to make that happen and to be as flexible and open as possible to allow a wide variety of conversations to occur in the hopes that it helps to allow the society to move forward in a positive way.
This is Joe Cohen. It's a commentary, and I like to acknowledge it because he says the idea of the meal, the symposium, is in fact also what he believes took place at the Slavery Museum in Liverpool, which has been doing that. He acknowledges it's a good idea and notes that. So I just wanted to say that. Irache Momoitio from the Guernica Museum in Spain asks, can you tell us if there is anything written or in the webpage about the dialogue session and dinners you mentioned that were done by the Smithsonian? And by the way, I'd just like to say, before you answer that, that this webinar, as all previous ones, will be published on the IC Memo website under its own title, and also the papers collected or shared today. Please, Spencer.
I believe there are examples of some of the dinners, seat at the table. But I think really our goal for its effectiveness is not to have it online, but to really have it as a one-on-one interaction with individuals. And what we have done is talk with other organizations to help them understand how this format refitted for them can work in their situation. In fact, just before the pandemic hit us, our staff, some of our staff was about to go off to England to talk with some of the museums there, some of the organizations there about this format so they could figure out how to adopt it there and to use it in ways that are effective for them. I think the key is there is sort of a framework here, but what's important is that in each setting that institution, that organization, that group of people figure out how to use it in a way that works most effectively for them. But what I think is clear is that food is a good starter for conversations to follow.
Yeah, thank you. This is a point that Suai addressed in terms of what we want to create in our communities. We need to create first in our museums. So it is addressed to you, Spencer, but I would also address it to Suai, which is the question is regarding looking within the museum structure and staff. And she says, this is Jane. Many discussions throughout the museum community in the US have been addressing the lack of diversity on the staff at the level of management particularly, and how can museums turn the approaches and lessons of outreach to communities to discuss the inequities within. So turning outside in instead of inside out, and maybe both of you, Spencer and Suai, can say something.
Suai, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go?
No, please go. I asked the question.
She'll think about it.
I usually have the answers ready. Yeah.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I thought in the context of this talk, I couldn't go quite to the level of depth, but you're absolutely right. Is that what's also important for our institutions is that diversity is reflected throughout it, that it goes from the board to the staff, to the people on the floor, to the collections, to the exhibitions, that you've got to show that in fact, that diversity is a principle of operation for the institution itself. And if people come and can't see themselves, not only in the exhibitions, but in the staff, when they go to the webpage to see who's on the board, then you've sort of come up short in terms of the steps you can take to really show that you are committed to this kind of diversity and this kind of operation.
We could perhaps also add that it is a matter of credibility for the museum, for its audience to see what it preaches is something that the museum itself implements as well. And I think this is quite important as far as credibility goes for us as museum professionals and our museums. It's not only what we exhibit, but also what we do in order to exhibit what we exhibit, or what we do as activities, how we do them. Yeah.
Basically, put your money where your mouth is, as you say, as we say in America. There's difficult questions. Do you know museums that would explicitly say they would not make a stand or open the floor to discuss or address social responsibility issues? And if yes, what were the arguments against?
Here's what I'd say. I don't think there are any museums who would say that openly, but I think the challenge is, how do they operate? What kinds of exhibitions do they do? How inclusive are they? What does their staff look like? That, I think, speaks louder than sort of saying that you believe in something. It is, as you said, putting your money where your mouth is. And I think there are still museums and places where they are not really paying enough attention to their larger community and really are feeling that they will provide what people need to know and know that best.
Anyone else want to add anything? Luisa or Kahinda, just of your own accord, before we open up the floor to commentaries. Kahinda, please.
I just would like to emphasize the impact, the conscientization element of going to watch and see exhibits in the museum. That when you are able to see or watch what men of valor, militant people or revolutionary people, or people who have defended the rights of their own community have done in the past, it's enough to inspire you to want to make sure that you also stand for your own for your own generation. And I think that's one thing that is obvious from one's interaction with museums. When you are able to see what Martin Luther King was able to do, you are inspired. You know, when there is a crisis, you realize, you contextualize it as a generational responsibility that you needed to discharge. And I think that's what is exhibited, how it is exhibited, the kind of commentary that is captioned. All these go to influence whoever is in the museum environment on what it takes out of that environment matters, depending on how the packaging is also done. I also think that I should make this point going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kahinda. Luisa, we've had many thank you notes to all four of you. And if there's anything that you left unsaid, Luisa, that you'd like to add to the conversation, please.
Well, I think that museum policies, most especially in Nigeria, that I know of, should be revisited. There are too many limitations, for example, government museums. I mean, there are too many limitations to what you can actually put out. And I think that's an area that I don't know who can, which body or organization can help in that area, but I think that's one area we should actually look into, because it limits the the ideas and of the museum professionals and what they churn out, what they bring out. And I don't think that's right. I think we should be at liberty to, present, to be able to speak out, not to be stifled in any way. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. Anyone else? Are we okay? I want to profusely thank all of you, including Massimiliano, for being there for us. Thank you, Suwai. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Luisa. Thank you, Kahinda. Going to conclude with a thought. When I think of ICMMO's mission, which is to draw lessons from history towards building a more peaceful society, I'm reminded of the philosopher George Santayana and his famous quote, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." But then I also think that he wrote, history is a pack of lies about events that never happened or told by people who weren't there. Now, this is our opportunity to tell the true stories because we are here. Let's make a difference. We must come out of these crises with greater awareness, common respect, real justice, equal access, and global solidarity without there being just words. And I think this has been a very inspiring contribution to creating that reality. But just a reminder, and we must continue to stay alert and work together, furthering cultural cooperation in the interest of peace.